Okay.
That should do it.
Okay. All right. I
Yep. There
started
you go.
recording.
There you go. Now I don't know how I'm going to get the MP file, but we'll have to figure that out later.
Oh,
You may have just
I'll send it to you through Dropbox.
Okay. All righty. Well, I guess we'll get started. Like I said, there'll be people coming in here. I think I could still introduce you from this end, and then you can get started. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Well, thanks for coming tonight. We appreciate everybody coming. I know that you've been on a lot of our calls, and we're the weekly apologetics meeting here. Of course, we meet at Ohio State, but our year kind of wrapped up there this term. We'll hopefully be back in the fall, starting to meet on campus again. But in the meantime, we're still doing some Zoom meetings for now, as we have been doing the past year. So we're so happy tonight to have Dr. Michael Keas. I found out about Dr. Keas through his book, as I'm sure he can mention. That's when I saw some of his videos as well. So he's an expert on the relationship between science and religion, especially between the history, the history that's behind all the years of the supposed conflict of the years between science and religion. So he knows a lot about the history. I'm going to tell you that when I got into apologetics, especially on the internet, which I don't do a ton of internet apologetics anymore, the average person on the internet knows nothing about the history of science and Christianity. I'm just not trying to be arrogant. It's just the way it is. It's just when you deal with people, it's very frustrating on the internet. Of course, sometimes on college campuses too. There isn't a lot taught on that. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And I have given Dr. Key some questions to go over, and he knows all about them. And so we're really pleased to have him. He's out in Oklahoma right now. But Dr. Keys, can you just tell us quickly about yourself and how you got into this field? I know you teach at Biola. So tell us a little bit about yourself before you get started, so we kind of get acquainted with you.
Sure. So my wife is a nurse practitioner, and as she travels about and does her thing, I write and I speak. This is after having taught full time for 25 years at 3 different institutions, including Biola University, where I'm still retained on a part-time basis, and in the science and religion program, which is a master's program.
Mm-hmm.
And but my specialty is the history of science and the philosophy of science, and how science and Christianity have interacted over time.
Okay, great. And how many books you have this book out? I know you got the 7 Myths book. Is there another? Have you published any other books by chance? Not that it matters, but is that your big one?
It's my big and only one up to this point, but I've published in anthologies where there's a number of essays, mine included, and I have numerous book projects in the works. But over the last year, I've spent a lot of time researching RVs.
Okay. Right. And how'd you get involved with Ratio Christi? I know you're on the board there, right? So what brought you to that? You're kind of newer to that, aren't you? I mean, last year or so.
Actually, I've been on the board for a decade.
See, what do I know? I feel silly. I'm sorry. Right. I don't interact with the board that much. That's the issue as a director. So I'm sorry, but go ahead.
Oh no, that's fine. And Simon Brace of South Africa,
yes,
he was one of the founding members, and he contacted Bill Dembski of the and Bill recommended that he contact me to be on the board. So that's how it happened.
Okay, great. Well, it's all good. Yeah, I know Simon. Well, I can do a very good impersonation of him sometime. I won't do it right now. But anyway, all right. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and get started. And you want to pull up your slides, so we'll start. Just go right into it. But anyway, okay, so I think the first thing we need to talk about is this conflict. That people think that there's this ongoing conflict between science and faith, or science and Christianity. We call it the warfare model. So do you want to talk a little bit about the conflict model and how we got to that point and why it's been propagated so much in pop culture and elsewhere? Is that what the first thing we want to kind of tackle?
Sure. And just to check, so Eric, you can see the slide that's up there, right? Can you see the slide?
I can't right now. Did you hit? Oh yeah, I can see it. Can everyone else see it though? Well, no, hold on. I can't. You hit share, right? Yeah, you hit share.
Eric, I can see it. I can see it. It says introduction, Eric. Shabbat,
okay, all right. You're fine.
Okay,
go ahead, Dr. Keys. Yep, you're fine. Right. Go ahead.
So what I particularly am looking forward to tonight is, Eric sent me some great questions way ahead of time. And so I just plopped his questions, like the one here, which is kind of the introductory question. And then you'll see throughout the show, the slideshow, there will be slides from Eric's questions, and then I'm just arrange my slides to go with the questions that he asked. And this is a new way of presenting some of the material I've presented in other formats in the past. So I'm excited about this. So thanks, Eric, for your work. And as I've told him,
thanks for putting it together. I appreciate it.
Eric has done more work on preparing for actually reading my work than any other host I've had before. So thank you so much. Well, yeah. So I
try to be prepared. I don't want to go blind.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. But yeah, there is this received wisdom that says that science and religion are typically at odds with each other, and that's because of the stereotype that you've outlined here in your email to me, Eric, of faith being just fantasy and emotional and subjective, whereas science based on observation and dispassionate and objective. And there are dispassionate and objective aspects to the Christian faith, as there are aspects to science that are highly subjective based on the worldview that the scientist brings to bear when they come to do their research. That's going to have can have a distorting effect on the scientific research they do. So there really isn't two separate categories. Science and faith overlap a lot. Every scientist has some faith in something that is ultimate, that is self-existent, able to exist on its own, whether it's just matter and energy or the multiverse or whatever. They think that something is that which that persists and just simply is, and always has been. And we of course think that that's the God as revealed in the Bible. So that's the basis of the so-called war between science and Christianity, that they're opposites and they're just always conflicting with each other. And that's why I wrote the book Unbelievable, is to dispel this overall warfare story. But I did so by means of a number of very specific stories that are used to build the larger warfare narrative. So for example, let's take one of them that you mentioned in your questions, the dark myth. That is the idea that during the Middle Ages, Europe was, of course, dominated by the church, which is true, but that this allegedly made Christian Europe a very anti-science culture during those years. Well, there is some partial truth in that in the early medieval period and late antiquity, as Christians often absorbed the Roman attitude that didn't highly value science. I mean, the Romans did some science, but it wasn't as highly valued as the Greeks, as they valued it. And so there were many Christians that kind of absorbed this ambient culture, but over time, Christians created a new civilization called Europe. And European culture has turned out to be extremely friendly to science, and was the birthplace for modern science. So take St. Augustine, who was the most significant Christian intellectual in the early phases of Christianity up until St. Augustine in the late medieval period. And so until St. Thomas Aquinas, I mean. So St. Augustine is on the border between the end of antiquity and the middle and the beginning of the Middle Ages. And notice what he wrote. He said that we should proceed by most certain reasoning or experience to discern how God established the nature of things. And that phrase became the title of many books in the medieval period, people trying to figure out how God did it. For example, Roger Bacon, in this tradition, he of course read everything he could on what others had done on the topic of light, how light works and how vision works. And so he read Greek and Islamic scientists on this, but then he did his own experiments and his own thought and critique, and took the science of light or optics and to a higher level. And more significantly in the long term was Christians invented this institution called the university. Secular universities were a much later development, and the church supported these without telling them in detail what they had to do. So there was a lot of academic freedom within certain boundaries to pursue research. I like to cite an atheist, Tim O'Neill, who's got a blog with lots of great entries called History for Atheists. And notice what he says about the so-called Dark Ages. It's central to several key elements in new atheist bad history, that is inaccurate history. And so it's kind of fun to have someone who agrees with almost everything I've said about the so-called Dark Ages, that they really weren't dark. And this is coming from an atheist who realized that a lot of his fellow atheists get this wrong. So it's good resource to have. So the Dark Ages really never happened. That is the alleged, anti-science and anti-intellectual influence of the church. The church actually helped to give birth to modern science. So that's one of those war stories that is easily debunked by, and I just gave you the short version. My book gives the long version in one of my chapters. Let's cover one more myth of this sort, and then I'll see if there's kind of questions along the way about the dark myth and about the big myth, and then and make sure everyone is tracking with me. And by the way, hello, Ohio, and there's about 27 of you that now, and I think that, Eric, I think I've admitted them all. There's no more admit buttons there, so I'm doing my job.
Some of us are spread out. Some of them are in other parts, though. They're not all in Ohio.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. This kind of a mixed bag. Yeah.
Okay,
That's okay.
well,
you're fine. Go ahead.
All right.
Okay.
So, all right, Bill Nye, speaking to the American Humanist Association, wrote, "I'm insignificant. I'm just another speck of sand. And the Earth, really in the cosmic scheme of things, is another speck. And the sun, an unremarkable star. And the galaxy is a speck. I'm a speck on a speck, orbiting a speck, among other specks, among still other specks, in the middle of specklessness. I suck." At first, you might say, Bill, speak for yourself. But notice Eric is on the right track here, where in his email, he said, Bill probably still thinks that humans mean something of significance. So what does he mean by this, I suck? And if you look at the how so many people who don't believe in God still think equality and justice, social justice is important, as Christians also think, although in a somewhat different way. We still think that social justice is extremely important. And Ratio Christi just updated our statement of faith with a new statement on social justice, by the way. You might go check that out. So it's very important to us, but not in the way that the far left wants to take it. So so human life, all human life is important. Atheists and Christians generally agree about that. But if you go to the end of his speech, or a little bit later on, he goes on to say, we do have significance because, hey, we can do science. It's amazing what the human mind has been able to do, operating through this multi-pound brain, to be able to discover so many amazing things about the universe, including its great size and our small size by comparison. But what Bill is doing here is he's conflating size with significance, and it doesn't really logically follow. But what he means by significance here is probably religious-based significance. That is, if we're so small, how could we be a big part of a divine plan if we're insignificantly small compared to the size of the cosmos? I think that's what he's driving at, and that's why his audience, the American Humanist Association, which was giving him the Humanist of the Year award, was so pleased, because they don't believe in God either. And they were pleased that it seemed like science is telling us that we're not in any religious sense significant, and therefore we suck in that sense. But we don't suck because we can do science. That's where Bill's coming from. So Eric, I think you're right on target here with that.
That's just a very, very sad quote, but go ahead.
Yeah. Now, continuing with what I call the big myth, look at this ancient Hebrew poetry. For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his steadfast love toward those who fear him. Now, does it sound like this psalmist has the background knowledge that the universe is big or small in order to write this? Well, if the universe is really, really big, then he can use that as a way of illustrating the greatness of God's love for us, right? So clearly, this poet thought the universe was really big. And he's religious, and he's not a scientist, but he thinks the universe is big. Let's pick an ancient scientist, the most famous of all of them, Ptolemy, besides Aristotle. He thought that Earth was really tiny, almost like a point, which is mathematically dimensionless compared to the distance to the stars. And he had an argument for this. So we had a pagan Greek who thinks the universe is really big, that is, Earth is really small compared to, to the universe, and we have a Hebrew poet who thinks the same thing. They come at it from different angles, obviously, but they're converging on the same solution, same conclusion. Now let's pick up on how C.S. Lewis helps me debunk the big myth. Now he notes that humans in general throughout time, we imagine, or we seem to feel as if space is three-dimensionally extended out for infinity. Now, of course, there are scientific theories that say otherwise nowadays, but according to the human imagination, it seems like space just goes on and on and on forever. And that's true of us today. It's true of ancient people. Now, Lewis goes through the different possibilities. Given that most people kind of feel like space just goes on and on forever, what if there were no objects up above our heads except for the sun and the moon? What if the universe in terms of its physical stuff was limited to just Earth, sun, and moon, like really small? Therefore, Earth would be really big compared to the size of the Earth, sun, moon system, right? Well, of course, the atheists, as Lewis notes, would say no, God would create lots of wasted empty space. I'm kind of paraphrasing Lewis actually here, but that's what he says, that the atheists would clearly use this as an argument against God if that were the case. Now, of course, this is not the case. There are a lot of objects up there besides the sun and the moon. And Lewis says, well, if there are other objects, and of course there are, well, those objects must be either habitable or uninhabitable. And now I'm quoting Lewis. And the odd thing is that both these hypotheses are used to reject Christianity. So, all right, let's take the possibility that there's billions of habitable planets up there. Well, if there's billions of planets, many of which have actual intelligent beings on them, then the atheist would clearly use this as an argument against human significance in any religious sense by saying, look, humans are lost in a crowd of aliens. How could you believe that God would become incarnate in Jesus Christ as a human in human flesh? You know, we're not significant. That's just a made-up story or a fairy tale. Well, what's odd is if the exact opposite were true, which, by the way, the scientific evidence currently shows that habitable planets are extremely rare. Okay, the only one that we know of for sure is Earth, of course, but habitable planets, that is, planets capable of supporting life, there's so many things that have to be just right for this to be possible that based on what we know from physical laws and how life as we understand it through science, not science fiction, which is pretty much unlimited as to what you can imagine, but a scientifically disciplined view of ET would have to have a planet very much like Earth in order to be an intelligent being like us. So if planets are generally uninhabitable, which the evidence currently shows, the atheist can easily use this as a no-God argument, right? No, God would create all these sterile planets, right? No, what lousy design, right? Horrible design. He could have done a much better job and made more of them habitable, So the argument goes. Now, so in summary, the big myth is a myth because it's really not a rigorous objective argument. It's very much a game. It's a metaphysical game because metaphysics is the study of what is. It's really not a scientific game because no matter what is, they're just going to say, well, see, no God would have done that. And Lewis runs through the three different major options on this and shows it to be a rigged game. Heads I win, tails you lose type of game, which, by the way, as a young child, I discovered very early on isn't a fair game. So yeah, there we go. All right, now, do we have any questions from anyone thus far? And Eric, how would they unmute themselves or how would they go? Can you hear me, Eric?
Yeah, I'm muted. Okay, yeah, they just unmute themselves and they know how to ask questions. Or they might put them in the chat room as we're talking. They could do it that way too. So if anybody has any questions, you can ask now and mute yourself or else put it in the chat room. I'll give you like 5 seconds.
And if no one pipes up now, and if they can pose their questions in the chat room, then I guess you or someone can go look at the chat room and then ask them later, right?
Yeah, we can bring it up later. Yeah.
Okay.
No problem. So just keep going if nobody talks.
Cool. All right. Very good.
Okay. We're good.
All right. So we've got this the dark myth and the big myth. both of them initially face value sounds like Christianity is, you know, debunked, or Christianity looks anti-science, looks like it's an anti-scientific posture, but it's not the case at all as you look at the details. Now, there's also, besides a metaphysical game rigging that's going on here, there's also an epistemological game rigging. Of course, epistemology is the study of knowledge, how we know what's justified belief, you know, belief worth having, and so on. Well, there is an epistemological game rigging going on under the umbrella of scientism. Now, we're not talking science, we're talking a philosophical view about science called scientism. That is the view that only science, often defined as only the natural sciences, is rational. Everything else outside of that domain is not rational. It's just subjective belief. Now, J.P. Moreland, and my colleague at Biola, has written a whole book about this. It came out a couple of years ago. And there is an objection that he and many others have brought up, that this is self-defeating, because the very statement, only science is rational, is itself a philosophical statement. It's not something you discover through a microscope or through experiments. It's a philosophical, that is an epistemological kind of a posture that one takes when they claim that only the natural sciences are rational. Now, that's a good objection, but the more some of the recent replies to this objection include this one. Well, let's just enlarge the domain of science to include philosophy. And this kind of pertains to your questions, Eric. So if you enlarge this circle of science and say science is just any systematic knowledge that's testable, then there is a degree to which philosophy is also testable. But my objection to that, and which I've published in a paper just recently, is that this is game rigging if your philosophy assumes that there's no way to test whether or not God exists. It's kind of, you know, heads, my science and philosophy wins because it's testable. Tails, you religious believers, because you have a really big untestable component to your belief, namely your religious faith, which influences your science and your philosophy. You have an untestable view at bottom, and therefore you lose. You know, heads, I win, my view is testable. Tails, you lose because you're the foundation of your view is untestable. Well, there's a really good counterexample to this claim, which I bring up in my essay on this that I published just a few months ago. And that is that there are certain components of certain religions, particularly Christianity, that are testable. So the resurrection of Jesus is a central claim of the Christian faith, as you all know. And so you can test this by evidence. Now, I'm going to do just briefly remind you of how it is testable. And this is based on William Lane Craig's book, A Reasonable Faith, which is a great kind of a medium level intro to apologetics. So, all right, so either God raised Jesus from the dead or something else happened after his death. Some atheistic theory would explain, you know, a conspiracy or whatever. Well, there are three facts that any theory of what happened to Jesus after his death would have to explain: an empty tomb, appearance reports. Many people claim that they saw him. So you got an empty tomb and appearance reports that are facts. That is, it's a fact that people claim that they saw him. And then third, it's a fact that there was an absence of resurrection expectations from people at the time. Jews were expecting a general resurrection at the very end of time, but not something like this. So, yeah. So any theory is going to have to explain these three facts. So now let's run through two of about a dozen major theory traits that any good theory would need to have if it's going to hold water. The first is the most obvious: evidential accuracy. If a theory is going to be worthy of your belief, it should be accurate to the evidence that's at hand, right? So it should make sense of that evidence. So the problem with many of the naturalistic, that is, no God theories of what happened to Jesus after his death is they typically, many of them take the form of conspiracy theories. But there are really big evidential problems with this because the tomb was well guarded. It was very, very difficult to steal the body and to concoct a conspiracy based on a stolen body. So conspiracy theories of the sort that I have in mind here score low in evidential accuracy, whereas the God raised Jesus from the dead actually scores quite high in this category. Let's take one more category of comparison of competing theories, and that would be causal adequacy. So this second theory virtue is, well, does the theory propose a cause that could, in principle, explain the effect that needs to be explained? So, for example, self-interest can lead to conspiracy. Self-interest could be causally adequate to produce a conspiracy, but in the case of the resurrection message, many of the original proclaimers of this resurrection message died martyrs' deaths. So it's not in your self-interest to die for a resurrection message if you know it's a lie, which would be the case if it's a conspiracy, right? So this aspect of the conspiracy theory really scores extremely low in the category of causal adequacy, whereas a real resurrection, a bodily resurrection, would produce sufficient motivation for martyrdom, because if Jesus had overcome death and can give eternal life, then you're willing to lay down your life and follow him. And that's indeed what many of Jesus' early followers did. All right, so that gives you just a little bit of taste which Christianity, certain components of Christianity can be evaluated using the same kinds of theory traits that scientific theories and many other theories of history, other theories of psychology, and many other fields. Okay. All right. So I've also published an essay on this topic of theory virtues, or theoretical virtues, as they're called in the literature, and this essay of mine covers 12 of the major theory virtues, and I just gave you an example from the first and the second one, how it applies to to an important central component of Christianity, and therefore Christianity is testable. And so if those who want to say scientism excludes religion, well, at least it doesn't exclude Christianity, because Christianity has components that's testable. And if they want to enlarge science to include philosophy and other thought that's testable, well, Christianity is testable and actually passes the test quite well. Okay. So now, Eric, why don't you, are you able to unmute yourself and just say a few words about this? You took a look at Rosenberg's book, right?
Yeah. Do you want to mute Michael or Dr. Keas? I can't mute some of these people. There's a guy named Ron right below your name on the participants. Can you mute him?
Oh, sure.
I just heard something in his background was real loud. So if you can just mute that.
No problem.
See what I mean?
No problem.
Okay, you got it? Okay.
Got it.
Hold on a second. Let me go back to slides here. So Rosenberg, he's kind of interesting. Where is it? Yeah. So when I looked at his book, he tried to make science kind of answer just about every worldview question there is, including questions that are really more philosophical in nature. Questions like, what's the purpose of the universe? Saying there is none. What's the meaning of life? Nothing. Why am I here? Dumb luck. He's just really overextending the bounds of what science can and can't do, in my opinion. So that's an example of the scientism, like you mentioned, right? And so that's what really I found to be amusing, that he just tried to do way too much with science in this book, in my opinion. And I don't know. So I just thought it was kind of interesting, that someone tried to do this, tried to make science answer questions that it just really can't answer. So, I don't know, are you in agreement or?
Yes, I am. In fact, Eric, I use Alex Rosenberg's other major book, which is the leading introduction to the philosophy of science. It's used in more grad schools and undergraduate courses on the topic than any other book, that, as far as I'm aware. And there are some inconsistencies between Rosenberg as a polemical atheist, which is the case in the book you're citing here, and then Rosenberg as the academic philosopher of science, which he is. Right. And he's a good one. And there's some inconsistencies there that I bring out when I teach about this at Biola University in the master's program in science and religion, which you can find online if you're interested in that sort of thing. So I think that these are clearly philosophical questions. Now, notice the question: what is the nature of reality? What physics says it is? Well, look, physics is devoted to how do things operate assuming a closed system. You know, if there's a closed system and one object hits another object, what will happen? Well, you know, physicists can tell you, you know, it can predict what's going to happen if nothing from the outside impinges on the situation otherwise. But physics doesn't know. Physicists don't know what there is beyond just the physical dimension, you know, mass and energy and things like that. I mean, clearly those things are real, but physics doesn't tell us that other things that are non-physical can't be real. Physics doesn't say that. Physics only says if you're going to limit your investigation to just physical things, well, this is what we can know about those levels of reality, and legitimately so. It's a great field of knowledge. It's wonderful, but physics can't tell us about the nature of reality. That's ridiculous. And Rosenberg knows, he knows better than to do this, but that's Rosenberg as polemicist. And
right.
So, yeah, that's sad when you see that he's not really acting as a professional philosopher here. But of course, there are a lot of people who will say, well, he's doing this because he'll say, well, his philosophy is a philosophy that's informed by science. Well, so is mine. So is yours, Eric. You know, our philosophy, our theology is also informed by science. So, and science really can't tell you what the nature of reality is. It assumes certain things, and based on those assumptions can crank out some really interesting results. But there's a lot more to reality than physics could even possibly study. So yeah, this is just illegitimate, and it's part of what I call the scientistic warfare myth. It's okay. The scientistic warfare myth is scientism. You know, the claim that only science, whether it's the natural sciences or somewhat enlarged to include anti-theistic philosophy as a science, which is what Rosenberg wants to do. This scientism claim, plus stories like I'm just a speck, you know, from Bill Nye, or the Dark Ages were dark because of the church. Actually, they weren't really dark. They were full of illumination as you look at what came out of the Middle Ages. But these stories plus scientism together make up what I call the scientistic warfare myth, which helps a lot of people imagine a world without God. And by the way, they need a lot of help because it's really hard to imagine a world without God. There's so many strong intuitions that I mean, look, the vast majority of people on the globe think that some God or gods is required to make sense of reality, overall reality. And so the people who don't believe in God need help imagining a world without God. And the scientistic warfare myth helps them to do this. Illegitimately so, of course, I argue, but at least they've got something to go for and to help them. Kind of a crutch. I'm using myth here in the anthropological sense of a worldview shaping story with other components that are partly true, partly false, that shape the way someone can understand the world. And we've already noted that scientism falsely assumes that Christianity is untestable. And I've just showed you that Christianity is testable and passes the test when it comes to the resurrection. And this scientistic warfare story also includes the idea that Christianity hinders evaluative methods of science, this testing process. And I can give you an example from the history of science that shows how the history of science itself defeats this scientistic warfare myth when it claims that Christianity hinders the development of evaluative methods of thinking. And this is what I call the flat myth. And it'll just take a few minutes to describe this myth, why it's wrong, and why it helps on the positive side to show that Christianity has helped with the evaluative procedures used in the sciences. All right. How many of you, just answer in your own head, how many of you were taught this? That Europeans thought Earth was flat until Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492 and showed otherwise. Okay, most of you are saying, I think, yes, that's what I was taught. Well, it turns out that's wrong. That's false. During the Middle Ages, when the universities were growing rapidly, you know, a Christian invention. Here's the oldest building in Oxford. I've touched it. It's Merton College, Oxford. And in the Middle Ages, when students were in this very building you're looking at, they learned arguments for a spherical Earth. They could reason from observations to the conclusion that Earth is spherical. In other words, they evaluated the claim. What is Earth, a basketball shape, or is it a pizza shape? They could evaluate this claim by evidence and came up with the conclusion that Earth is spherical. And of course, this knowledge goes clear back to to ancient Greeks, but it was continued to be taught and practiced in the Middle Ages, and using the evaluative procedures of the sciences. So now, what I want you to do is, each of you in your own head, I'm going to not show you that slide yet. Think of one reason you could cite, based on observation, why you could draw a conclusion that the Earth is round instead of flat. In other words, think of some observation you have made or could make, and from that, draw the conclusion that Earth is round rather than flat. Okay, I'll give you 15 seconds to think of one. All right. Now, did any of you think of these two? There's more than just two, but did any of you think of these two? That during a lunar eclipse, the Earth's shadow, which goes over the moon, is definitely curved. It's a curve. The edge of the shadow is curved. And that shows that the object projecting that shadow is curved. Okay, and from this and other evidence, you can infer roundness. How about this other observation, that the North Star, the one that doesn't appear to move in the course of the night, if you travel far north, that North Star will appear to be higher and higher in your sky as you travel further and further north, until when you get to the North Pole, it'll be right over your head. Now, medieval students were aware of these two lines of evidence, that they both point to a round Earth, as well as maybe the one you thought of when you see a ship coming in, you see the top of the ship before the bottom of the ship. Okay, probably a lot of you thought of that one. And medieval students knew of that evidence as well. Now, our Christian universities, and they were all Christian, of course, is Christianity, as it's infused in culture in a vast educational system that was unprecedented in the history of the world. Hundreds of thousands of Europeans went to universities. That was an amazing, humongous population of students compared to anywhere else in the world up to that point in time. Yes, there were educational institutions in other places, but not on this scale. And they were being taught this kind of thing. Is this promoting or hindering the evaluative methods of science? Well, clearly promoting it, right? I've given you just a case study here. So Christianity doesn't hinder the evaluative methods of science. It's actually helped to develop them and to proliferate their use among a humongous population of people that is compared to ancient and medieval counterparts in other cultures. So clearly the scientistic warfare myth is a myth. It's a misreading of the situation. And I've given you all the reasons why it's a myth, but it's very popular. And it's also popular in the Cosmos series, which Neil deGrasse Tyson helped to host in its two most recent iterations, 2014 and 2020. And this scientistic warfare myth helps us to imagine a world without God. They need help, and this is one way to do it. It's an illegitimate way to do it, and I'm calling them on the carpet for it and showing why that's not legitimate. Yeah, if you're interested in my essays about this, I debunk the scientistic warfare myth in an essay in 2021. If you just Google my name, Keas, K-E-A-S, and scientism, you'll find it. Or if you're interested in my essay on theory virtues, published in 2018, just, again, Google my last name, Keas, and virtues, and you'll find it. And yeah, so why does all this matter? And my book goes into this. Well, it's interesting that Christianity ends up being the main target of these 7 myths about science and religion that I cover in my book. Of all the world's religions, Christianity is the one most picked on. And I think the reason for this is Christianity has had the most relationships with the development of science. And as you look at the details, positive relationships. Yeah, there are some rather uncomfortable episodes, which we can talk about in Q&A, about the Galileo affair and so on, but they turn out to be much more complicated than the simple science versus God story that you get. So these 7 myths that I debunk in my book make it seem like science flourishes only with the progress of atheism and with theism, particularly Christianity, being pushed back. And this scientistic warfare myth is simply wrong, and it's very damaging because it gives people a really wrong impression about science and God. And I'm a believing Christian, and I've devoted my life to the study of science, particularly the study of scientists, as a historian and philosopher of science. I study scientists and how science works. But also as a teacher, college level teacher of science, contemporary science, I think that I can, science and Christianity are friends. Christianity has always been the friend of reasoning, especially scientific reasoning. All right, so now, any thoughts, questions? A lot more we could cover, but I just want to make sure you're tracking with me, and if anyone has any questions.
Dr. Keas, could you quickly, I do think it's necessary, I'm sorry, could you maybe just mention the misunderstanding with the Galileo thing? Since people still bring that up, could you just briefly maybe summarize that, why that comes up so much?
Sure, sure.
It comes up so much, I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, the short version of this is, and I have a chapter on it in my book.
Right.
Is that Galileo was himself, he considered himself a faithful member of the Catholic Church. So it's not like science is Galileo and the Catholic hierarchy is the church. And furthermore, the Jesuits at the Collegio Romano, I mean, we're talking the College of Rome, right there in the Vatican City. Those Jesuit scientists, they agreed with all of Galileo's new observations through the telescope. They confirmed them all and agreed, but they disagreed with the interpretation. And at the time, during Galileo's lifetime, there really was no proof that the Earth moved and that the sun is at the center of our local part of the universe. There was no proof of that. There is obviously now, and it took about a generation after Galileo for that to be made clear. So to do accurate history, you have to limit yourself to what was known at the time. You can't import illegitimately what we now know. So Galileo really failed to make his case for a moving Earth. He made a pretty good case, but it wasn't compelling. And the church was right that he didn't prove it, and therefore they were under no obligation to accept it. And there was an alternative view that was different than the ancient view, different than the Copernican view, that was kind of a hybrid called the Tychonic system. And it was actually best supported by the evidence of the time of physics, and it was also supported by the majority of theologians. But there were theologians who favored Galileo's view. They were a minority, and there were a few scientists that favored Galileo's view. They were in a tiny, tiny minority. Maybe the lesson to be learned here is that the church should not be too quick, and I'm talking about the Catholic Church in this case, to punish the world's leading scientists for exaggerating his case. Obviously, Galileo exaggerated his case. The church was right about that, but they should have handled the case much more in a much more culturally sensitive manner, and not the way they did. It was during the Counter-Reformation. They were a little bit trigger happy because they were trying to put down the Protestant rebellion and so on. So there's a whole much bigger story to be told that's behind it. It's not really science versus religion. It's growing pains within science and theology both. It's not one versus the other.
Okay, great. All right. Well, I do have one more question. I'm going to let someone else have some questions. Anybody have any comments or questions for Dr. Keas? Anybody want to jump in here with anything? Sometimes they start real slow, Dr. Keas. Anybody?
That's fine. That's fine.
After they get it, I always tell them, like, stop eating your cereal right now. Pay attention. Anyway, put down that bowl of Doritos. Anybody want any comments or questions? Yep, they're shy tonight as usual. All right, well, I'll also ask the question as I think about it. So anyway, would you say that the evolution thing is still an ongoing problem, this big debate? It just, sadly, I think evolution's turned into, I call it evolutionism, where it's become an entire worldview to kind of like answer every question of reality, sociology, religion, psychology. I mean, it used to be just about biological change, but everywhere I go now, it seems like on campus, it's like, yeah, I took a class in psychology and they say evolution says this. I took a class in this and they say evolution says that. I mean, it's turned into being like this robust worldview. It's a whole worldview as it kind of overtaken. You've seen that kind of happen. I'm sure you already know that, but it's kind of sad, isn't it? It's kind of gone in that direction.
Right, because there's evolution of a certain limited kind that can be documented, namely microevolution, very, very trivial small scale change. But to extrapolate from that to large scale change, well, the evidence just doesn't support it. And then to further extrapolate to say that everything can be explained by this is even more irresponsible. So it's similar to the irresponsibility of Bill Nye saying, because we're so small physically, that means we're insignificant in any traditional sense of significance, particularly religious sense. That just doesn't follow. And in a similar way, this would apply to the evolution debate. But I would recommend going to discovery.org for a lot of resources on that. I'm a fellow of Discovery Institute, and most of my colleagues deal with contemporary science rather than the history and philosophy of science. Yeah.
Are you hopeful that the new book by Dr. Meyer, The Return to the God Hypothesis, there seems to be a lot of hope that that's going to make a dent someplace? I'm about 200 pages done. I should be finishing it quicker.
Yes, I've read it. I read it before it came out, and Steve and I interacted on a number of points because he does do a little bit of history of science there, as you know.
Right.
But yeah, it's a great book. I think it's his masterpiece. Yet his earlier books, major books, of course, dealt with the transition from no life to life. And then his second book, The Major Kinds of Life. Now the third book puts those first two books together, and then it shows the wider implications. It's a masterpiece.
Yeah, it's good so far. I like his illustrations too. It's got some good. Someone doing his illustrations doing a good job.
Yeah,
and I don't think it's him.
and Eric, it pertains to the earlier discussion. It shows that the Christian worldview and theism more broadly is testable. And passes those tests because he's doing comparative worldview analysis there, and shows that you can use evaluative procedures to do that. And he actually does cite my theoretical virtues essay in his book.
Right. Yeah, it's a good book.
As does also the Australian physicist and astronomer Luke Barnes. He's got a number of books. He is a leading, astrophysicist, and he, in his most recent book, actually cites my entire classification of what are the good traits of a good theory, and we interacted a bit over his book before we published it with Oxford, or Princeton. Anyway, I think it was Oxford.
It's funny at Ohio State when we brought in science speakers like James Torr or Michael Strauss. I forget who else we had. We had Paul Nelson years ago.
Good.
Everyone makes out to be like all these campuses, all they care about is science, 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 science. You might hear in some of the discussions with students things, but if I compare the turnout for some of these science guys, I mean, don't get me wrong, they're brilliant. They're great and everything, but turnouts seem to be better for like popular level apologists. You know what I mean? It's interesting to me that I'm not putting them down or anything. I mean, popular apologists have their role, James Warner Wallace, Frank Turek, and these guys, or William Lane Craig. But it just seems that it's interesting to me the students don't seem to be, as much as they give lip service to how much science. Then when you have a big event with James Torr is one of the top chemists in the world, or they just don't. I mean, we have some interest. It's just not as big as it is with the popular level apologists. So. It's just funny. I just find it always fascinating. You know what I mean? That when I see that, it's just kind of an interesting ongoing thing that it's just interesting to me. I don't know.
Sure.
Anyway, so just from doing events.
Right.
But anyway, well, anybody else have any comments or questions? Anyone want to jump in here with anything? You never deal with anybody that mentions these issues? Come on, jump in. Anybody?
Like William, Wilbert, Stephen, Shane, Ron. I see you're all there. Rhonda.
Herb. John, Ian, Mariah, Nate, from Richard. Okay, he's got a chat. Something in chat. Many people today, can you read that, Dr. Keas?
Why don't you just read it for me, Eric?
Many people today. Well, I have to go to the chat. Oh, there are two things in the chat. I'm sorry.
Okay, great.
I've been pointed. Here we go. Okay, well, first let's do Ian's question because Ian was before that. I'm sorry, I missed it. So here's Ian's question. From the top of the cliffs of Moher, 400 feet high in Ireland, overlooking the Atlantic, the Earth looks curved to anyone regardless of education. Whether it is sound reason or not is irrelevant because it looks curved. I don't know. That's a comment. So anyway.
Yeah, well,
comment?
It's hard to know how much of the appearance of curvature is sort of the expectation, because when you look at the horizon, there is kind of the feeling that it might be somewhat curved, but the Earth is so stinking big compared to the size of our body that it's pretty hard to really objectively perceive the curvature of the Earth just by even standing up on a mountain or whatever, So there are, so there really isn't a direct visual, oh, look, the earth is round. If you're just standing on the earth, there's really no way to know that. It does have the appearance of being flat for the most part. But there are still some great arguments for a spherical earth.
I was using that as a way of saying that the people in the Middle Ages who may not have had an education they would not necessarily themselves even think that the earth was flat unless they lived in the middle of Russia or something. Because they could, if they were by the sea, in a high enough place, that even it's regardless of the education, it would be an impression that they'd have.
Yeah, maybe so, depending on, some of that is culturally dependent because, and of course geographically where they lived, as you noted, because it's easier, water seeks its own level, and so you can see the horizon circle more distinctly when you're out on a big lake or on the ocean. But again, the horizon circle, how much of that really is showing you a horizontal curvature, how much is just as far as your eye can see, gives you kind of an impression of curvature that may not be objectively measurable, which I think is more likely the case. But yeah, even if there's somewhat of an impression, maybe some would take that to be evidence of a spherical earth. Maybe so in some cultures. I'm not aware of that, but it could be. Good point, Ian. Thanks. And how about that other question in chat?
This is just a comment. I think this is more a practical question on interacting with people. I don't know. I mean, it's so much related to your talk, but it says many people today are steeped in Marxism view. Many people today are steeped in Marxism views. Rational thought as racist. Well, that is true. I have seen that somewhere. Actually, they think that logic and stuff is a white supremacist thing, but that's of course ridiculous. But this opens a whole new challenge to apologists. To me, the only way past this is to get people one-on-one and face-to-face, and by that I exclude forums and other social media interactions. Well, let me just apply this to your work, Dr. Keas. How much time do you even spend? I know you're an academic, so I mean, you don't have time to sit there on social media and debate pop atheists and people online all the time, like many of my academic friends do, right? You don't get into those discussions.
No, in fact, I don't even do social media at all. But I'm glad. But still, Eric, I'm glad that there are many Christians out there that are trying to make to speak to people on social media. It's an important job. So it's just that it's not my calling. But I have, my interests are very interdisciplinary. And so even just preparing for the statement of faith section on social justice, we did, Simon Brace and Corey Miller, of course, they have more background in this area than I do. But I am familiar with culture studies as it pertains to science, where back in the 1990s, there were the so-called science wars, where there were a lot of deconstructionists, who applied it to science, the history of science, and tried to say, well, even scientific knowledge is all just about race, gender, ethnicity, and all that kind of thing, and that there is no objective world to be known. It's just all socially constructed. And so in my own field of history of science, there is a strong component of practitioners of history of science who think that, but there are still plenty of others, and especially philosophers of science, who say that's ridiculous. And that science does have some, not a perfect grip, but some legitimate grip on the real world outside of our minds. And therefore, it's not racist to be someone who's devoted a lot of their life to the life of the mind. There are intellectuals from every ethnicity, not in the same proportion, but that's not, everyone has the capacity to learn if they have the cultural environment that helps them to want to study these things. They could study, and no matter what their ethnicity. So it's not racist to champion scientific technology or science, even though it is true that science did develop largely because of its Christian underpinnings in European civilization. But that science is now universal. It's all over the world, and no matter where it's gone, anyone from any race, gender, whatever, can, if they want to, can study this and learn lots of things. And it's not inherently racist to trade in the to engage in scientific discourse. Although some will argue that, but I think it's really a bad argument. Doesn't follow.
Yeah, but anyone in a Marxist view that would view rational thought or wanting rational thought as racist is ridiculous, because anyone that anyone that believes their Marxist views are true believe that they're generally rational. You know what I mean? That they're based in reality, and I'm assuming they believe they're true because they're trying to impose them on other people. So you can't make any worldview work without rational thought. So it's just self-defeating. It's just the silliest thing anybody would say that they believe.
Yeah.
That. Anyway, so that just doesn't work. That doesn't work at all.
Yeah, exactly. Those who are taking a far left perspective on cultural studies and social justice and all that kind of stuff, they're making arguments that you ought to believe what I believe, right? And they're trying to convince you of that. Well, they're reasoning with you. So if their reasoning includes the proposal that reasoning of a certain sort is racist, well, it undermines their own point. So
yeah. So Carl is asking on chat, have you heard of Science Mike? I haven't heard of Science Mike. Do you know who Science Mike is?
Is it like a...
You're not Science Mike.
Okay. Well, I'm not Bill Nye the Science Guy, but I'm not Science Mike either.
Yeah, I haven't heard of Science Mike. I have heard of him, I think maybe once.
No, I haven't. I haven't. Okay. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Carla, do you want to elaborate on that? You're on the call. I don't know. We don't know what you're talking about. Do you want to speak on that?
Sure. He was he an atheist but he had this supernatural experience with God in the water, and he's now like I don't know, maybe in the progressive church he's a big name.
And what is his name again, Carla?
Science Mike.
Okay, and like M-I-K-E or M-I-C?
No, like Michael. Mike Mick Hargu.
Yeah, but Science Mike for short. Well, I'll look him up and see where he's coming from, Carla. Thanks for the heads up. But what's your read on Science Mike?
I don't know that he really is. Well, I think he's definitely not an evangelical, maybe, and coming against some. I don't know. I think there's some problems with him.
Yeah,
so,
sure. Okay.
By the way, Dr. Keas, can you go up on your chat on the participants thing and put me back as host? You know how to do that? I think you can make me back to host now. Just go over my name and make me host. Where I hit more under my name, and then you should be able to make me host.
Make host. All right, you got it. Change host.
oh wow, I feel so special. I'm back. How exciting. I'm in control. Oh, neat. Okay. No, I haven't heard of Science Mike either, but I'll have to look him up too.
Finding God in the Ways, How I Lost My Faith and Found It Again Through Science. And he in this one Religion News, it says Science Mike may argue Christians aren't stupid and atheists aren't evil. So
well, I have to look him up.
Okay.
I don't know. Yeah, I'd have to check him out. I don't know. I want to mention you, Dr. Keas. The main question we asked at Ohio State over the last spring semester was, does God exist? That was our #1 outreach question. And you'd be interested to hear that the people said yes. It's like a yes, no, or don't know question, on our whiteboard. And we asked them why they say yes, if they do say yes. And the two reasons they will say, most common reasons, are religious experience and creation. They say that they just don't think like an undirected process could account for the whole world. And now keep in mind, these students are all taking biology, intro-level, freshman level. They're taking evolutionary thought, right? But we ran into so many of them that still say that there's just no way this all could come together on its own. They just still, it's intuitive almost. You know what I mean?
And their intuitions are actually tracking with the real world, and they have good reasons for those beliefs. So I
was encouraged by that, though.
Yeah.
So I was kind of encouraged versus just, I thought maybe they'd say something else, but that's the second most common reason we hear. So we heard that a lot. So I thought that was good. Anyway, so I was encouraged. I mean, this is a college campus. Everyone says, oh no, there's no creator or anything, no creation. So anyway, so that was kind of encouraging. All right. Well, maybe a couple more. Anybody else have any other comments or thoughts on anything? Any science related issues? Any questions or anything?
I can I ask one more question?
Absolutely.
What would you say to Christians who are flat earthers or disc earthers?
Yeah. Well, I would say that they have misinterpreted the Bible if they think that the Bible requires belief in a flat earth. The Bible uses ordinary observational terms, not theoretical terms, when it comes to earth, sun, moon, basic furniture of what's around us. And so, and this feeds into the Galileo affair, because Galileo and many theologians at the time recognized that, well, the point that I just made, that the Bible, when it talks about sunrise and sunset, and when it talks about the four corners of the earth, this is not actually teaching a cosmology. It's not teaching whether the earth moves or not. It's not teaching whether the earth is flat or round. It's just using ordinary world picture language. It's not trying, it's telling us that God made the world, God interacts with the world, this is all real, but it's just using ordinary observational terms to describe the world, and then to say God did this on purpose, it's not an accident, and so on. But there's only a really tiny minority of Christians who are flat earthers. And I've studied a little bit of flat earthism today, and it's a lot. Some of the people that are claiming to be flat earthers are just trolling. They're just kind of trying to, rile people up. There are some that are actually believe in it, but there's just no good reason to believe in it, theologically or scientifically. So I would take it as an opportunity to educate my brother or sister who is a flat earther. And I have actually only met one person in my life, and I've been speaking on this topic for years, who was a Christian and believed in a flat earth. Only one that I actually met in person. So they're rare.
Thank you.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. Anybody else? Any last comments or thoughts or anything? You guys are all so quiet tonight. What happened to my screen? Where's everybody here? Oh, there we go. Anybody else? Any last thing? I guess.
Any more in the chat room, Eric?
No. Charles, did you want to ask something? You're unmuted.
Yeah, Dr. Keas.
Yes, Charles.
When we're thinking about the scientific, the apologetics from the scientific standpoint, you've been doing this for, like I said, a number of years. Would you say that that argument is increasing or decreasing? And what is probably the hardest or the most complicated question or theories that are being addressed in the current day about science and God and Christianity, I should say?
Right. Well, yeah, I think that the number and quality of scientific arguments for the beginning of the universe, for its fine tuning, for the multiple independent origins of the basic life forms, all of which are best understood as God doing these things, is on the rise. They continue to proliferate, and this is good. This is God's general revelation of the sort that the Bible itself would lead us to expect we could discover, because Romans 1 says there's certain things about God, not a whole lot, but there are certain things about God that you can strongly infer based on just looking at the creation, looking at the natural world. So the number and quality of these arguments is on the rise, and that's good news. But there, as far as difficult areas, the second part of your question, I think that one of the challenges is as these arguments proceed forward, there's all kinds of ways for someone to creatively find excuses to circumvent the impact of those arguments, and that's a credit. That's tells you something about the inventiveness of the human mind and the human heart, when they're trying to avoid God. So the multiverse argument is, well, look, no matter how fine-tuned the universe is, no matter how unlikely it is that life could come from non-life by an unguided material process, and so on and so forth, at all these different levels of arguments, no matter how unlikely these events are, if there's an infinite or virtually infinite number of universes, that is, if your probabilistic resources are inflated, that is, if you can roll the dice so many times, you'll eventually get a full house or whatever, like in Yahtzee or some game involving dice, maybe poker or whatever. Actually, poker's not involved. Anyway, some game involving dice. You can eventually get the very, very unlikely to happen. But this comes at a great cost. So even though the multiverse argument seems like a way of getting around these arguments, Steve Meyer goes into this in his book, this most recent book that Eric mentioned. And so I'd invite you to go there to look at it. But it turns out that even the multiverse argument assumes there is a multiverse generating mechanism, which itself would require some sort of design. So they're kind of kicking the design problem down the road and not really getting around it. So, but it does show that no matter how good these arguments for God or for a designer become, and they are becoming more precise and more rigorous, there's always ways that humans can find excuses to deny God. And we find that expectation in Scripture as well, that people will do that. But one of the epistemological costs of the multiverse is, just imagine a court of law where, let's say, thousands of pieces of evidence point to somebody did it, right? This guy murdered his wife, whatever. Well, if the jury really believed in the multiverse, they could simply say, well, in some possible universe, there will be a case where there's thousands of pieces of evidence that point to someone did it, but we have legitimate doubt because we might be in that universe where this just was a freak of nature that it happened this way. And so the multiverse is really corrupts ordinary reasoning, the sort of reasoning that would be able to be used in a court of law to convict someone of a crime. And so in other words, the multiverse, if taken seriously, would undermine the judicial system, would undermine social justice of all kinds. So there's big cost to be had if you buy into a secular multiverse kind of way of getting rid of God. Thanks for the question, Charles.
No, but thank you for being with us tonight. Thank you for your diligence.
Who here is a science major? Say something about your major and I might connect with you. No science majors. Well, I'm glad you came anyway to hear me tonight. How about social sciences? Yeah?
Oh, sorry. Not a science major, but a philosophy major who's interested in philosophy of science. I'm interested in all of the philosophy that's out there, but philosophy of science. I was actually going to ask you whether or not, or I guess any particular books on the philosophy of science that you could recommend, and whether or not you would recommend Rosenberg's book, even though he doesn't necessarily follow all of the points. I guess so it's introductory on philosophy of science and not his more popular level.
Right. Yeah, it is a good book. This is Rhonda speaking?
This is Mariah speaking.
Mariah, okay. Yeah. I use in my Biola course, which is a master's level course in the philosophy and theology of science, I use Rosenberg's book because he does clearly lay out his chapters. He's got a great section on inference to the best explanation, and the criteria for bestness. Which explanation would rise to the surface as being the best? What are the criteria for bestness? Well, they're the theory virtues that I talk about in my essay. And I've been asked to be a blind reviewer for many different people who've published on or tried to publish, and many of them have actually gotten published that I've blind reviewed in philosophy journals and in other journals. So yeah, Rosenberg's book is a good book. And then what's fun is to catch him in acts of duplicity, where on the one hand, in his philosophy book, he admits that the foundations for a philosophy of science where you think you really are tracking with truth, naturalism has a hard time coming up with that foundation. He admits that in his textbook, but he doesn't do that in his popular level book. So I think, yeah, I would recommend that to you, his book, and then But I would then put that alongside other books like J.P. Moreland's book on scientism would be a great book. Came out a couple of years ago with Crossway Books. That would deal with one just special topic in the philosophy of science. I would take a look at my essay that I just published a couple of months ago. If you Google Keas and scientism, you'll find it. Del Ratsch, he's an older Del Ratsch, Ratschch, something like that. Del Ratsch.
Yeah, I have one of his books.
Yeah, he comes from the Reformed tradition. He's quite a good philosopher, and he's published on the limits of science, and I think he's done well. William Lane Craig, of course, one of his specialties is philosophy of science. So in the book that Craig and Moreland co-authored, it's a little bit dated, but it's still good. Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. They have several sections in there that pertain to the philosophy of science. And so I would recommend that as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Well, yeah, there's plenty of reading to do, plenty of research, and I sent out Dr. Keas' PDF on the original email and the invite for this call. I encourage you all to read that.
Okay.
So you kind of have a little heads up, where he's coming from with some of this stuff. So you can always read his PDF. It's very helpful. And I actually sent that to somebody online this week who was debating a bunch of atheists online. Typical kind of these kinds of objections came up, very basic things. So,
right.
Dr. Keas, do you think also a lot of people, and I'll wrap it up here, do you think that I find a lot of people are really unaware of the Christian influence on medieval science, like how it got started in that period, like Meyer talks about in his book, on the, not only, they weren't all theists. Some of them were probably deistic, but at least they believed in a God that created the laws of nature. And that's how kind of gave science the rise that, gave it the foundation it had. Do you find a lot of people just incredibly ignorant about that as well?
Yeah, I published an essay that was a sort of a precursor to my book in a Harvard Press collection of essays called Newton's Apple and Other Myths About Science. Now they have an essay in there it's a hack job on intelligent design that's horrible. It's unfounded, but there are a number of essays there. I have one essay that deals with the so-called Copernican demotion, that Copernicus showed we're not in the center, therefore we're not important, and where center and importance again are conflated. And if you look at the history, it's a lot more complicated. So, yeah, this popular level understanding of science and Christianity being at odds with each other, it's a myth that just doesn't ever die. It's out there. The people in my own field of history of science have debunked it for decades now, including my secular colleagues who don't believe in God. At least they admit that Christianity has not typically been at war with science. So yeah, but that message needs to be made more clearly accessible to people so that they don't keep just perpetuating the old stories that get into the textbooks. The textbooks just repeat the same stories over and over, and textbook authors don't have the time to research every little point in their textbook. So I'm not putting down educators who write textbooks per se, because they're overviews of huge amounts of knowledge, but specialists in my area know that the typical textbook stories about science and God are just not accurate. So.
And now we've got it. You're an expert if you have a YouTube clip, right? So that's the other problem we have. So anyone can put a YouTube clip out there. Yeah, on campus, many students disagree with John Sanford on genetic entropy. Do you have a response? Well, I have that book by John Sanford. We'll make this the last question, but I have that book. I thought it was pretty cool, but I don't know, Dr. Keas, don't make this your last answer. Do you?
Yeah, well,
do you know that book?
John Stanford is a young Earth creationist, but he is a major academic. He's at Cornell University, and so I'm not familiar with that specific argument from Stanford, but I know of Stanford. He's a legitimate academic. I'm not a young Earth creationist. I think the universe and the Earth are old, so I come from a very different viewpoint, and I think that this is consistent with the Bible. But it's totally fine for Christians who believe in a young Earth to develop their theories. That's fine and legitimate. more power to him. I just have a different opinion about that. And but that particular book I haven't read yet, so I don't want to tread on something I haven't studied.
Yeah, I met him at a conference, and he had that book there, and I talked to him a little bit about it, but it's an interesting book. I don't know why everyone would disagree with it. Unless you're an expert on genetic entropy, you know, I don't think college students have that background, so I don't know how much they can really debate that topic.
Yeah.
That's some pretty technical stuff. So
right, yeah, and clearly
anyway.
he knows his field well, and so he's making an argument, and it ought to be heard. So yeah.
But anyway. Well, listen, Dr. Keas, we appreciate you coming on, and I know you're very busy. And by the way, everyone, you can watch his lectures. Dr. Keas has a lot of lectures he's done on his book, like certain sections. They're a series of videos you can watch online. I believe you can find them. So just look him up. He's made a lot of really cool, helpful videos that kind of coincide with his book. And you know, this is going to, like he said, that lie is going to keep going on and on and on about the warfare. So you better have some good reasons on how to respond to that, because it's not going away, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So we want to be prepared for that. And I think we've got a lot of good information out there in our, you know, in our areas, you know, like he mentioned some of his other books as well, and Dr. Meyer's new books. So we've got a lot of stuff we can give to people if they're interested. So when Dr. Keas, if someone walks by our table and they say they're a science person, I say, well, have you read Dr. Meyer's new book? I hold it up, or your book, and they're like, oh, I don't have time. You know, that, you know, so it's just funny, you know, how they kind of just put out. You know what I mean? It's like, as soon as you put something in their face, like you could just really catch up with what's going on in scientific discoveries. And, you know, but they sometimes, oh, well, no, I'm busy. I got to study for exams, you know? So I'm like, well, maybe in your own time. Well, anyway, well, thanks so much. And I'll follow up with you by email, but we appreciate you taking your time. Is there anything else you're working on right now that we need to know about that's coming now besides this book? Just still anything current, anything
well, I'm going to be in about 3 or 4 months completing a shorter version of my arguments about the different myths for Ratio Christi. It will be a downloadable book. You know, there's the most downloaded book on the RC website is the one on social justice. There's been a huge number. Well, mine's going to be in that series of, you know, kind of free,
the booklets,
free downloadable booklets. And so you can look to that.
Yeah. Right. Huge download on Neil Chevy's book.
Yeah.
The critical theory thing was downloaded.
I've read it. It's good. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I know. I've given it out. We can always PDF it to people. We've had him on a call too. He's been a busy guy. Well, we appreciate everything. And like I said, I'll follow up with you, but God bless you and all your work, and be safe as you travel around the RV with your wife. And I think that's pretty cool. You guys get to do that. So maybe someday we'll take up that endeavor, but thank you for your work, and thank you for spending your time with us tonight.
Oh yeah, and thanks to Charles, Carla, and everybody else who asked questions. I can't remember all the names, but thank you to all the students and friends of RC.
You got it. And everybody, I'll stay on the call for a little bit and talk about the rest of the month with you guys, what we're going to do. So anyway, if anybody else wants to stay on, I'll stay on for a couple more minutes. But Dr. Keas, if you want to go, God bless you, and I'll follow up with you.
All right.
Take care of yourself. Okay. Thank you so much.
Oh yeah, sure. Bye-bye.
God bless. All right, everyone. I'm still